Denver. And I just thought I would share a couple of thoughts that are kind of bouncing through my head, since I can't tweet them these days. I could say them out loud. So I'm not going to this event because I'm a Michael Bloomberg supporter per se. I support Amy Klobuchar, and if she ends up not doing well enough in Iowa or New Hampshire to stay in the race, then I'm not actually sure. But I kind of think I'll probably end up falling back on Biden as my second choice for electability reasons. But there's various candidates that I'm still considering. Bloomberg isn't really on that list, so I guess we'll see if he can add himself to that list by impressing me and persuading me at his rally today. But in any case, I was thinking about a couple of things. One is, there's this whole controversy right now about Bloomberg being let into the debates. The DNC changed the rules so that he can get in, even though he's not soliciting donations. And I'm of mixed feelings about that. On the one hand, I do think it's kind of ridiculous to have a situation where like a candidate who's polling in the top 4 nationally isn't in the debates because of a rule that basically says you have to get these sort of almost sham donations, where like what Tom Steyer is doing, where it's like, give me $1 so that I can pad my numbers of donors, even though he's basically self-funding. Bloomberg isn't playing that game, and that seems fair. I don't think that Bloomberg's approach is any less kosher than Steyer's. Like, they're both billionaires, they're both basically self-funding. I don't particularly love the fact that we have self-funding billionaires buying their way into the polls and into the race. But if we're going to have them, I'm not sure why it's particularly important that they also be soliciting like fairly meaningless tiny donations that don't really have any impact other than just to kind of like game the system. It's sort of like in college basketball when teams would employ these, back in the RPI days, teams would employ these very specific strategies to try to improve their RPI. They weren't really necessarily improving their strength of schedule in a meaningful way, but were just designed to improve their RPI. It's like, it's a weird analogy, but I guess my mind is in multiple places. But I don't know, it seems silly to not have him on the stage. At the same time, it is pretty, ridiculous that they changed the rules for him, but when they wouldn't for like Booker and I guess Castro and some others, notably candidates who are not white and who are not billionaires, but also just, candidates who are better credentialed. I mean, Cory Booker, is a U.S. senator. He's got the sort of traditional credentials for a presidential candidate. You could say the same of several others who've dropped out and who might not have dropped out if the DNC had bent the rules for them. And particularly when there was a period of time there where there were very few polls over Christmas, and so it was really hard for candidates to get the number of polls that they needed because there weren't enough polls, period. And so some candidates arguably, Booker in particular, I think arguably ended up dropping out because of that earlier than he otherwise might have. I mean, that sucks. And it sucks that the result was a less diverse field. And then finally when, we get to this point, now they're willing to change the rules. On the other hand, I get why they didn't want to, they did need to winnow the field a bit so that we didn't have like John Delaney and Tim Ryan, who I like, but, let's be real, and Hickenlooper, whoever, and again, another candidate who I like, but these people who are just, taking up space on the stage and reducing the speaking time of the candidates who actually might become president. It was good to have them in the early debates to see if they'd catch fire, but at some point you do have to narrow the field. And so, it makes sense to have some rules, especially in the early stages. And if they, I don't know, like it would kind of make sense if they'd said all along, like once the voting starts, we're going to go by polls and voting numbers rather than donors, like the donors are for the early stages. That actually would sort of make sense as a criteria, but the fact that they didn't set that out in advance and then they seem to have set it out just to help Bloomberg does kind of have a rotten feel to it. So I don't know. I'm very mixed on it all. At the end of the day, I think it is more sensible to have Bloomberg on the stage than not, because he is a contender. I don't think he has that much of a chance, but he is on paper a contender. He's in the top 4 or 5 in the polls. Now, having said all that, while it's probably the Bernie and Warren people who are the most upset about this, I think it helps them, but I'm not sure because it's complicated. So on the one hand, the way that Bloomberg helps, in particular Bernie, is that he potentially siphons off a key part of the moderate vote that probably would otherwise go to Biden. I mean, Klobuchar and maybe some to Buttigieg, but I think probably mostly Biden. The sort of hardcore establishment, the people who are establishment enough to be considering Bloomberg, which like people who are more establishment than me, like, people who are squishier centrists than I am, are probably Biden people, if they're not Bloomberg people. And so by splitting the vote, it actually probably helps Bernie, because imagine if Bernie wins Iowa and New Hampshire, and there's kind of like a freak out about, well, oh my God, we have to stop Bernie. But some people are going to say, well, we have to stop Bernie by voting Bloomberg, and some are going to say we have to stop Bernie. And that's like the Trump dynamic in some ways. It's a little different, but there's some analogy there to, the Republicans debating, are we going to stop Trump by voting Cruz or Rubio or Kasich or what? And so that potentially helps Bernie. The way in which it potentially hurts Bernie is a little bit more subtle, or to be more precise, the way in which it helps Biden is a little bit more subtle, but I think it's relevant. Like, Bloomberg does sort of create like a foil that can make Biden seem more acceptable by comparison to, like, not the hard left necessarily, because the hard left is probably never going to find Biden acceptable, but like the sort of semi-hard left, maybe like Becky, my wife, would be an example. She hasn't said this, but I could imagine a case where if it comes down to like Bernie, Biden, and Bloomberg, which is totally plausible that that's kind of the realistic field come Super Tuesday, I could see Becky saying, I don't love Biden, but I mean, Jesus Christ, he's better than Bloomberg, right? Like that could be a way that this plays out, and that could help Biden. If not help him to win, at least help him to unify the party after he wins, where it's like, if Bloomberg becomes public enemy number one of the left, then Biden becomes a slightly less divisive figure, and then once he's starting to wrap up the nomination, there might be a little bit less resistance because people are going to be more focused on making sure that Bloomberg doesn't win the nomination. I could see that happening. I'm not sure that it'll play out that way, but I could see it happening. And so it's an interesting monkey wrench. And obviously, I mean, some of this was potentially going to happen regardless of whether he's in the debates. But I think having him on the debate stage sort of like makes him more of a real candidate. I've had this weird sense with Bloomberg where it's like, I look at the polls that show Bloomberg at 7 or 8%, but I don't feel like he's actually running for president. Like, 'cause he's not. I mean, I see his ads, and increasingly my kids have been saying they see his ads with the new YouTube rules that make it so they can't target ads to kids. One of the unintended consequences of that is my kids are seeing more political ads because they can't target to them, and so like the algorithms don't know that they can't vote, and so they're seeing all these stupid Bloomberg ads. And so in that sense, it feels like he's running, but it's weird. Now I think it'll feel like he's more like an actual candidate. And so it'll be interesting to see how all these dynamics play out. And I'll be interested to hear what he has to say in a few minutes. I'm, of course, mainly going because I want to get his picture with Bali, because I have to get pictures of all these candidates with Bali. But it will be interesting as well to actually hear what he has to say. I've never seen Bloomberg in person. I've rarely even heard him talk. And because he hasn't been in the debates, I haven't really paid attention to his message. So it'll be interesting to hear if he seems like a compelling messenger for both defeating Trump and for the issues that I care about, but mainly for defeating Trump, because that's the main issue that I care about, is keeping Trump from being president anymore. So anyway, I'm going to stop babbling now so I can pay attention to where I'm going and park and everything, but stay tuned for hopefully a Bali picture with Bloomberg and maybe some other Bloomberg related content here. All right, that's it.